All right, welcome to the next module. This is the GDPR. All right, this is a compulsory module about the general data protection. And this module should give you general data protection regulation, which is the GDPR, essentially. This module should give you understanding of what the GDPR does and its principles. You should also explain each principle by the end of this module. So the learning outcomes for this module would be understand what a GDPR is, understand what personal data is, understand what data is not covered by GDPR, be able to recognize and understand each principle of the GDPR. So let's begin. So what is the GDPR? The GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, is the main law that concerns data collection and processing for organizations within the UK or organizations outside the UK, or which offer goods and services inside the UK. For example, Google offers Google services outside the UK, offers services inside the UK, even though the organization itself is outside of the UK. You use Google from home, but the company is actually founded and based in America. And if you're wondering what the Data Protection Act does, the GDPR is essentially the implementation of the Data Protection Act. So the GDPR is extremely important. As organizations must follow the principles of GDPR if they are to process and collect and process data legally. So if individuals know about the GDPR, they'll know how organizations must legally collect and process the data. This will further inform individuals of their rights. The GDPR is essentially the first law on data protection, which is relevant to big data. Yeah, the GDPR in itself is one of the most strict laws concerning data collection in the world, even though it's not as strict as you would consider, you'd say, one of the strict laws. There are many laws for data collection and protection in the world, but many individuals in different countries do not have the same rights as we do. So we must exercise our rights if we want the GDPR to continue to expand our rights and continue to protect our rights. We're lucky to have the GDPR, but it is not extensive as I would like to be after learning more about data collection. So the GDPR is all to do with personal data. This is any data that can identify individuals as personal data. A name or address, or any data one process can identify individual. So you have someone's IP address and a phone number and location. You can identify them if you combine them, essentially. So what data is not covered by GDPR? So any data that when collected and processed that cannot identify individual is not covered by GDPR. This means that information which is truly anonymous. The data about a deceased individual is not personal data, nor data about companies or public authorities. It is very unusual that data about it's been used of personal data about personal data pertains to a deceased individual is not covered under the GDPR, because this does have the potential to be sensitive data about a deceased individual, which could be exploited, but it's not covered. So it's important you know this. Now, there are 7 principles of the GDPR: lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality, security, and accountability. These principles lie at the core of data protection. These principles are not strict recommended rules which companies can find a workaround for, but rather companies must follow the spirit of the rules. This essentially means companies must adhere to the aims and the purpose of the law. A good example of following the spirit of the law would be if your mom tells you to go to school, but you go to school and then head straight back. You followed the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. You went to school, but your mom clearly wanted you to go to school and stay there for the duration of the school time. Breaking any of these principles could lead to a fine of 4% annual worldwide turnover or £17.5 million, whichever is higher. So it's not toothless, but many fines are much lower than this, and there's such a backlog of GDPR cases that it's unlikely you'll find remedy very soon. But if you want to find out what companies have been fined by the GDPR, you can go to enforcementtracker.com. This is mainly for EU companies, but the UK company works in the EU, and have broken their GDPR law. You'll see which companies will be fined. So UK GDPR and EU GDPR are very similar. Okay. The first principle is 3 principles, essentially: lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Lawfulness. The first principle covers aspects of lawfulness. First, let's discuss lawfulness. Organization is processing data. They need a specific lawful basis for processing. There are 6 lawful bases for processing personal data. You can see the module on lawful basis for more information on this topic. Also, organizations cannot do anything unlawful with personal data, violate human rights, or violate copyright infringement. These are quite extreme, but more common examples that we could give in example unlawful data would be doing something unlawful with your data would be fraud, or pretending to be you, or using your data to buy a product, or using your data to sell a product, something like that. Fairness. So personal data should never be utilized in a way and that might have unjustified impacts on the individual and only in ways that people would fairly anticipate. Unjustifiable and fairly anticipate are not defined by the GDPR, so it's up to you to explain why that data has unjustified impacts on you. It's important. Next, it's important to get the personal information in a clear and open manner. It's doubtful that data obtained by deceiving or misleading people will adhere to the fairness principle. Again, clear and open are not defined, but you do get a general understanding. It's up to you to. It is up to you to define these terms, but it's what you'd fairly expect. I can't. So if I say I want to collect data the data on how old you are, but then I ask other questions, but I'm doing that in a conversational manner, and I collect that data as well. So that would be considered deceiving you. Transparency. Finally, transparency is the last part of the first principle. When processing data, organizers must be clear right from the start who they are, how and why they're using your personal data. Organizers must tell users about the way their data is being processed, in a straightforward manner, which is simple and in clear English, so any layperson could understand what's being processed without needing further education, as well as make the information easily accessible. Transparency is important when individuals have the choice to enter a relationship with an individual, or when you have no direct relationship with an individual and you're still processing their data. So if a company is processing data on you, which they got from someone else, essentially, that's when they have no direct relationship. This happens more than you think. Because if you consent to your information to work in for maybe Verge.com, you're also consenting, except you're also consenting for all the affiliate partners to have access to your information. So look at the cookies when you say that, essentially. All right, the next principle is purpose limitation. This is the second of 7 principles of the GDPR. This essentially means that organizations must be clear from the start what personal data they're collecting, why they're collecting that data, and what they intend to do with that data. So they have to be clear about this, but most of the time, organizations will leave all this information, the privacy information of any website that is collecting personal data in the UK. So if you look at the privacy part of a website, then you'll know why they're collecting your data. Can organizations use data they've collected for a different purpose from what they stated? This can be a bit confusing, but essentially, no. Organizations cannot use or process the data they have collected, other than the reasons why they were originally given to the individual. If they want to process that data for a different purpose entirely, they must seek fresh consent. But if an organization's new purpose is compatible with initial purpose, or if there's a clear obligation set out in law, they can use that data without seeking fresh consent. So what are compatible purposes? So let's break down the idea of compatible. Okay, so the idea being called original purposes means that it must be something that you reasonably expect. If you give your data from consent, you really expect to use that for that purpose, that new purpose they've defined. So another way of putting it is that if the new purpose is very different from the current purpose, they must seek fresh consent, as is incompatible with purpose. If collecting and processing personal data will be unexpected, organizations must seek fresh consent, as it's incompatible with purpose. So if I give my data to my doctors, I give my data to my doctors because I go to A&E, for example. That's an example of me I expect them to collect and process that data for my medical purposes. But if they therefore give that to a insurance company, or insurance company uses that for increasing my life insurance rate, that'll be an example of an incompatible purpose. If collecting and processing personal data would have unjustified impacts on the individuals, organizations must seek fresh consent as incompatible with the original purpose, i.e., particularly sensitive data such as sexual orientation or ethnicity. For example, the unjustified impacts could be the same as I said, the insurance purpose. If they increase my insurance, would be unjustifiable and unreasonable for me to expect that when I give it to A&E. Organizations do not need to seek consent for these purposes. Archiving for public interest, i.e., management of justice, function of parliament, for the purpose of historical and scientific research and statistical purposes. Okay, statistical purpose is a very vague phrase in the ICO, as all data collected will be used for statistical purposes. But in this case, it means data collected and processed which is not personal data, and therefore cannot be used to identify an individual. All right, that'll be the end of this section. Now take a break, scroll down, and you'll see an anagram grid. I'd like you to have a go at that, and you should be able to answer the questions on there. Thank you very much for listening to the first part of the principles of the GDPR.